If Tony Stark never became Iron Man, if he never built the suit, never turned pain into purpose, never found redemption, you wouldn't get a superhero. You'd get Howard Hughes, a billionaire, a genius, a playboy. But without the suit, without the heart, and without the arc of redemption. Just the raw, unsettling truth of what it actually looks like when unchecked brilliance meets unlimited power and slowly caves in on itself. Just like Tony Stark, Howard Hughes built things too. Machines, marvels, weapons of war. He made planes for the US military, designed futuristic bombers, took secretive defense contracts worth millions. Like Stark, he profited from the business of war. But unlike Stark, he didn't stop. He didn't evolve. He just vanished deeper into himself, into fear, obsession, and decay. Because here's the thing. The playboy billionaire fantasy that works on the silver screen, the charm, the swagger, the recklessness, doesn't play the same in real life. In real life, it leaves people damaged, isolates the man himself, turns brilliance into obsession, turns women into possessions, turns privacy into paranoia. Howard Hughes was all the worst parts of Tony Stark with none of the heroics. He built some of the fastest planes the world had ever seen, and then refused to fly again. He romanced the brightest stars in Hollywood, then tried to control them like puppets. Actresses like Hedy Lamarr, Ginger Rogers, Rita Hayworth, Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, Jean Harlow, Yvonne DiCarlo, Lana Turner, and many others. He owned film studios, casinos, entire hotel floors, yet he couldn't touch a doorknob without a Kleenex. Couldn't sleep in a bed without 12 jars lined up to collect his urine. He started as a golden boy, America's restless genius, and ended as a shadow behind a locked door, barely recognizable, with bones like glass and fingernails like parchment. This is the story of the man who could have done anything and did everything except save himself. Stay with us. Because once you step into the strange, glittering, suffocating world of Howard Hughes, you won't want to look away. Not until the very end. But before the end there was, first, a beginning. Before Howard Hughes became a name whispered through the velvet halls of Hollywood and broadcast across the headlines of aviation records, he was just a sickly, brilliant boy from Houston, Texas. And even that origin story reads like a cocktail of money, sorrow, and unsettling genius. Howard Robard Hughes Jr. was born on December 24th, 1905, into a world of privilege. His father, Howard Hughes Sr., was the inventor of a revolutionary oil drilling bit, a device that would not only change the petroleum industry forever, but also lay the financial foundation for the Hughes empire. By the time little Howard took his first steps, the family was already entrenched in high society. The money was flowing, the power was real, and expectations were sky high. But here's where the fairy tale starts to fray. Howard was a sickly child. He suffered from a variety of illnesses, including, by some accounts, a strange form of partial deafness. He was also deeply introverted and obsessive, traits that would later calcify into something far darker. His mother, Aline, doted on him. Smothered might be more accurate. She was terrified of germs, obsessed with health, and raised Howard in a sterile bubble. It's not hard to draw a straight line from her neuroses to his eventual spiral into crippling germophobia. In some accounts, Aline would inspect his body daily for signs of illness. No scratch or bruise went unexamined. Imagine growing up in a world where your body was always under suspicion, your health always hanging by a thread. His father, meanwhile, was busy becoming one of the richest men in America. But tragedy struck early. In 1922, when Howard was just 16, his mother died suddenly from complications related to an ectopic pregnancy. Barely a year later, his father followed her to the grave, dying of a heart attack. Just like that, the teenaged Howard Hughes was orphaned, but not destitute. Far from it. He inherited 75% of the Hughes Tool Company. The remaining 25% went to relatives. Hughes, not content with merely being rich, fought tooth and nail in court to gain full control of the company, and he got it. At 18 years old, he wasn't just rich, he was independently powerful. No board, no trustees, just Hughes. It was around this time that he began showing signs of what we might now call obsessive-compulsive disorder. Hughes became increasingly fixated on precision. Whether it was math, machines, or social situations, he needed things to be a certain way. He also began exhibiting the early symptoms of paranoia. He didn't trust easily. He had a knack for spotting deception, or at least thinking he did, and he believed the only way to protect himself was to be smarter, faster, and richer than everyone else. That might sound like the script for a future tycoon, but it was also the foundation of a man who would eventually build a cage out of his own compulsions. Now, Hughes wasn't satisfied with simply running a business. No, he wanted immortality. And he believed he could buy it, or build it. He enrolled at the California Institute of Technology and later briefly attended Rice University, but he didn't stick with traditional education. Instead, he hired private tutors and engineers to teach him what he wanted to know. Aeronautics, engineering, film, anything that could make him larger than life. By the time he was in his early 20s, Hughes had moved to Los Angeles with two obsessions: airplanes and movies. Both would define his legacy, and both would nearly kill him. What made Hughes different from your average rich playboy was his genius. That's not speculation. He had a legitimate mind for engineering. He designed aircraft, tinkered with engines, and understood aerodynamics better than many of the so-called experts of the time. He was never content to sit in a boardroom. He wanted to fly. But it wasn't just about flight. It was about control. Hughes didn't want to participate in industries. He wanted to dominate them. The idea that someone might tell him no? Laughable. He had the money. He had the mind. And now, thanks to personal tragedy and total control of his fortune, he had the freedom to do whatever he pleased. And what pleased him was chasing greatness, no matter the cost. This was the era when he began financing ambitious film projects and obsessing over aviation records. The world saw a young, dashing daredevil with a fortune to burn. But those closest to him already knew something was off. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also volatile, demanding, mercurial. He didn't just want to be the best. He had to be. And if the world didn't agree, he would either bend it to his will or disappear into one of the many silences that would define his later years. Howard Hughes wasn't just born rich, he was born driven. And when a man like that loses the only people who could tell him no, that's not a man to admire. That's a man to watch very carefully, because when he falls, he won't just break. He'll crash and burn in full view of the world, and take others down with him. When Howard Hughes landed in Los Angeles in the mid-1920s, he wasn't just another millionaire kid with big dreams. He arrived like a lightning bolt, determined to conquer the film industry, and by extension, the hearts and bedrooms of the most glamorous women in the world. Armed with the kind of bankroll that could make anything possible, Hughes set out to create not just movies but spectacles. His first major project, a World War I aviation epic called Hell's Angels. But Hughes didn't just want to make a war movie. He wanted to break the sound barrier of cinema. He scrapped the nearly completed silent version of the film when talkies became the rage, then reshot the entire thing to the tune of nearly $4 million. That was an astronomical figure for the time, making Hell's Angels the most expensive film ever made up to that point. The shoot was pure chaos. Hughes hired real pilots to fly real planes through real stunts. 3 people died making that movie. But Hughes didn't blink. He was obsessed with authenticity, even if it cost lives. If a shot wasn't perfect, he demanded it be redone. If the clouds didn't look dramatic enough, he waited. Days, weeks for the right weather. That kind of micromanaging became his trademark. It was also the first glimpse the film industry got of Howard's dark side. Ruthless, egotistical, and borderline reckless. To add more buzz, Hughes cast an unknown actress as the female lead, a teenager named Jean Harlow. Her platinum hair and sizzling presence launched her to stardom overnight. But rumours swirled about how Hughes treated her. Some say he micromanaged her wardrobe and acting. Others claim he saw her as a tool, a way to sell the movie, not a human being. That pattern repeated itself. Hughes collected women the way he collected planes. The difference? He often modified them too, literally and figuratively. Starlets like Billy Dove, Faith Domag, Ava Gardner and Jane Russell all fell into his orbit. Sometimes they were willing. Sometimes, it's said, they weren't given much choice. He was controlling, obsessive. Hughes would buy a woman a house, a car, a studio contract, then monitor her every move. He reportedly had private investigators tail his lovers, listening for signs of infidelity. One actress said she broke up with him because he wouldn't stop having her watched. He also meddled with their appearances. Several accounts claim Hughes demanded plastic surgery for his starlets, believing he could improve them. Jane Russell was one of his biggest obsessions. When he produced The Outlaw, he ordered custom bras designed to accentuate her curves. The film was so controversial, it was banned in several states. Hughes loved the scandal. He stoked it intentionally. It wasn't just about making a hit movie. It was about controlling the conversation. And in Hollywood, Howard Hughes had the money and nerve to do exactly that. But his influence didn't stop at the studio gates. Hughes was known for buying his way into bed with actresses, literally. It wasn't just that he was rich, it was the way he used that wealth. Some women said he was charming, eccentric. Others called him manipulative, cruel. One studio insider said Hughes treated women like property, a statement echoed by several of his exes. He also developed a reputation for pulling strings behind the scenes. He allegedly blacklisted actresses who refused him. He threatened studio execs. He even tried to ruin careers, according to Hollywood gossip. Some of these claims are hard to verify, cloaked in old-school whispers and industry fear. But one thing is clear. Hughes saw people as instruments of his will. If you didn't play the tune he wanted, he cut the music entirely. Still, for all the damage he caused, Hughes had talent. He pioneered aerial cinematography. He revolutionized special effects. He pushed boundaries. And yet he could never quite maintain human relationships. His world was one of fantasy, and in that fantasy, only he got to be the director. By the mid-1930s, Hughes was both feared and admired. He was dating the most beautiful women in the world. He had conquered the box office with Hell's Angels, and he was preparing to dive even deeper into aviation. But behind the glitz, the cracks were already forming. His need for control was becoming pathological. His relationships were turning toxic, and his bizarre behavior was no longer just an eccentric quirk, it was starting to frighten people. The Hollywood maverick had made his mark, but now he was preparing to leave the ground entirely. And the higher Howard Hughes flew, the harder he was destined to fall. By 1926, Howard Hughes had more money than he could reasonably spend, no one to answer to, and a bottomless appetite for greatness. But what separated Hughes from the countless trust fund libertines of the Jazz Age was what he chose to do with his freedom. He didn't just throw wild parties, though he certainly did that. He wasn't content to bankroll someone else's dream. He wanted to author his own legend, and where better to write it than in Hollywood? It was Tinseltown's golden era, an opulent parade of glamour and grit. The air buzzed with the energy of transformation. Silent films were about to give way to the talkies. The studio system was tightening its grip on the industry. And then in walked Howard Hughes, young, rich, ambitious, and utterly unwilling to play by the rules. His first serious foray into film was a 1927 gangster picture called Swell Hogan, a sentimental flop that never saw the light of day. Most accounts suggest Hughes shelved it after a private screening left him embarrassed. Some say he burned the only negative. Others claim he simply locked it away forever. Either way, it was a $40,000 lesson in creative control. If Hughes was going to spend money, he wanted to spend it on his vision, not anyone else's. So he set his sights higher, literally. What followed was Hell's Angels, 1930, a film that would become both a technical marvel and a portrait of obsessive madness. Originally conceived as a silent war movie, the production spiraled into a years-long ordeal after Hughes decided, midway through shooting, that talkies were the future. That meant reshooting nearly everything, recasting the lead actress, silent star Greta Nissen, whose Norwegian accent didn't suit the new audio format, and overhauling the entire production with custom sound equipment. And that wasn't even the hard part. Hell's Angels was, at its core, a love letter to aviation, a soaring, pyrotechnic spectacle that consumed Hughes's every waking thought. He didn't just want aerial footage. He wanted the greatest aerial battle scenes ever put on film. He bought dozens of vintage WWI aircraft. He hired, and often fired, multiple directors. When none could meet his exacting standards, he directed the flying sequences himself. He also piloted several of the planes, often at terrifying altitudes and with minimal concern for safety. During one shoot, he insisted on filming through low fog to capture the drama of war. When his cinematographer warned it was too dangerous, Hughes simply waited until the man was off set and flew the sequence himself. One pilot died during filming. Others were badly injured. It didn't stop him. Hughes believed danger was part of the art. The final budget for Hell's Angels ballooned to nearly $4 million, an obscene figure for the time. But when it premiered at Grauman's Chinese Theatre in 1930, it was a triumph of spectacle. Audiences had never seen anything like it. The film made Hughes a Hollywood heavyweight, albeit a rogue one. He had proven that he could not only fund a major production, but command it, every inch of it, down to the stitching on the uniforms. But the man who had just spent years obsessing over warplanes also had a flair for the romantic and audacious. By the early 1930s, Hughes was notorious for his liaisons with Hollywood starlets. His most well-known companion during this period was Billie Dove, a screen beauty whom Hughes fell for completely. The affair was serious enough that he proposed to her, and she accepted, at first. But Hughes's controlling nature and increasingly erratic behavior strained their relationship. Dove eventually broke off the engagement. In interviews years later, she would refer to him as brilliant but difficult, obsessive to a fault. Other rumoured affairs included silent film stars like Joan Crawford and Jean Harlow. Hughes didn't just date them, he collected them. In some cases, he offered them roles in his films. In others, he simply pursued them with relentless charm and a never-ending supply of gifts. Rumours swirled that he kept a private black book, detailing every conquest, ranked and catalogued like a museum inventory. That part may be apocryphal, but with Hughes, truth and legend often sleep in the same bed. What's clear is that he moved through Hollywood with the predatory grace of someone who knew his money could open any door, even the ones most heavily guarded. And it wasn't just sex and stardom that fascinated him, it was control. Hughes despised interference. He refused to kowtow to studio bosses, preferring to fund his own projects. He created the Caddo Company, a production house that gave him full creative oversight. Every script, every cut, every line of dialogue passed through him. It drove collaborators mad, but it also earned him respect, albeit grudging. And then there was the spending. Hughes didn't just live lavishly, he engineered his lifestyle. He purchased fleets of cars, filled warehouses with aircraft parts, and surrounded himself with private engineers and mechanics to maintain his growing collection of experimental planes. He built projection rooms in every home he owned, often watching the same films over and over, taking detailed notes on lighting, editing, or pacing. These weren't the habits of a hobbyist. These were the rituals of obsession. In 1932, he founded the Hughes Aircraft Company, a move that cemented the duality of his persona. Half Hollywood mogul, half aviation visionary. Though initially a division of Hughes Tool Company, it would become the crucible for many of his most ambitious and later secretive technological pursuits. But signs of his unraveling were already there. Friends and associates from the time recall episodes that, while not yet alarming, were certainly odd. Hughes would wash his hands until they bled. He had strange dietary restrictions that changed week to week. He began isolating himself more, preferring to communicate via memos, even to people in the same building. If he believed someone had slighted him, even unintentionally, they might find themselves cut off permanently. And yet, he was still magnetic. Directors, actresses, engineers, all were drawn to him. He had that rare alchemy of wealth, vision, and danger. You didn't know if you were going to work on a masterpiece or witness a breakdown. Either way, it was going to be unforgettable. By 1935, Hughes had completed another film, The Outlaw, though it wouldn't be released until years later due to censorship battles over actress Jane Russell's famously revealing wardrobe. But the project marked a turning point. Hughes was no longer just dabbling in Hollywood. He was bending it to his will, on his terms, at his pace, no matter how much money or sanity it cost. That same year, he broke the transcontinental airspeed record, flying from Los Angeles to Newark in just under 10 hours. It was the perfect marriage of his twin obsessions, public spectacle and personal achievement. He wasn't just producing movies about daring aviators. He was one. But behind the triumphs, something darker was taking shape. The eccentricities were becoming compulsions. The perfectionism was becoming pathology. His need for control was evolving into something far more rigid, far more brittle. Howard Hughes wasn't just a playboy or a prodigy. He was a man at war with chaos, trying to outfly it, outspend it, outdirect it. But chaos doesn't lose. It waits. And in Hollywood, where every spotlight eventually flickers, Hughes was beginning to cast a long, strange shadow. By 1935, Howard Hughes was no longer just a rich man with obsessions. He was becoming something else entirely, a myth in motion, blazing across skies and headlines alike. Hollywood had made him famous, but aviation would make him immortal. He didn't just want to fly, he wanted to dominate the heavens. And for a time, he did. That year, Hughes unveiled his first aviation masterpiece, the Hughes H-1 Racer. Sleek, silver, and impossibly fast, the H-1 looked like a machine from the future. It wasn't built for comfort or cargo, it was built for speed. Hughes had hand-picked a team of engineers and locked them into a hangar with one goal: build the fastest land plane in history. Every rivet, every inch of wing surface, every curve was scrutinized and optimized. On September 13, 1935, Hughes climbed into the cockpit himself and took off from a runway in Santa Ana, California. Minutes later, he tore through the air at 352.39 miles per hour, shattering the previous world record for a land plane. It was a feat of both engineering and audacity. Hughes had pushed the aircraft and his own body to the brink. But he wasn't finished. In January 1937, he set another record, flying from Los Angeles to New York in 7 hours, 28 minutes, and 25 seconds. By 1938, he had his sights on something even bigger, a global circumnavigation. On July 10, 1938, Hughes and a hand-picked crew boarded a custom Lockheed 14 Super Electra, heavily modified with advanced navigational gear and extra fuel tanks, and set off around the world. They touched down in New York just 3 days, 19 hours and 17 minutes later. Newspapers erupted in awe. Radio programs interrupted broadcasts. America hadn't seen a peacetime hero like this since Lindbergh. But where Lindbergh was a solemn idol, Hughes was something else, handsome, mysterious, and cloaked in an aura of unstable brilliance. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent him a congratulatory telegram. The keys to New York City were placed in his hands. He had flown around the world, and more importantly, he had done it faster than anyone in history. For a brief, dazzling moment, Howard Hughes was America's answer to Icarus, except he hadn't fallen. Not yet, but glory, in Hughes's world, always came with a price. As the 1940s dawned, the world edged closer to war, and Hughes, never content to sit still, pivoted from record-setting to weapons-grade ambition. He wanted in on government contracts, and his Hughes Aircraft Company began designing cutting-edge military technology, including radar systems, aerial weapons platforms, and reconnaissance equipment. On paper, it was a natural evolution, a patriotic genius lending his mind to the national cause. In practice, it was chaos. Hughes's obsessive perfectionism clashed violently with the government's need for speed and standardization. He refused to delegate, projects were delayed, costs ballooned, he micromanaged to the point of dysfunction. And worst of all, he had a habit of making bold promises he couldn't or wouldn't keep. Two of those promises would define the decade. First, the XF-11, a reconnaissance aircraft commissioned by the U.S. Army Air Forces. Second, the H-4 Hercules, better known by its infamous nickname, the Spruce Goose. Let's start with the XF-11. It was supposed to be Hughes's magnum opus, a sleek, twin-boomed marvel that could fly faster and farther than any spy plane on Earth. But by 1946, the project was years behind schedule and millions over budget. The military was losing patience, so Hughes did what he always did when under pressure. He took control, personally. On July 7, 1946, he test flew the XF-11 over Los Angeles. The flight began smoothly. Then disaster struck. A hydraulic failure caused one of the propellers to reverse pitch, a catastrophic malfunction. Hughes lost control. The plane slammed into 3 houses in Beverly Hills, erupting into flames. The impact crushed his chest, shattered his ribs, fractured his skull, and punctured his lungs. He was found barely alive in a bedroom, wrapped in debris and his own blood. It should have killed him. Doctors later said he survived, only because his heart was abnormally strong. Another strange footnote in the ever-expanding mythology of Howard Hughes. He spent weeks in the hospital, in agony. According to some accounts, he refused morphine after a certain point, relying instead on codeine and willpower. Others suggest the painkillers never truly stopped after that, just morphed into something darker, addiction. And from this moment on, something in him changed. Physically, he was never the same. Mentally, he began to recede into himself. The crash didn't just break his body, it bent his mind. But the XF-11 was only half the story. The other half was the H-4 Hercules, a flying boat so massive, so absurd, that it became both a punchline and a legend. Made almost entirely of wood due to wartime aluminum restrictions, the aircraft boasted a wingspan longer than a football field. It was intended to carry troops and tanks across the Atlantic, yet by the time it was anywhere near completion, the war was over. The military had no use for it. Congress launched investigations into the millions spent on both the XF-11 and the Hercules. Hughes was summoned to testify before the Senate War Investigating Committee in 1947. The hearings were brutal. He was accused of war profiteering, waste, and grandiosity. But Hughes, gaunt and defiant, fired back with one of the most electrifying performances of his life. "I have never been a quitter," he declared, "and if the Hercules does not fly, I will probably leave this country and never come back." A few months later, on November 2nd, 1947, in front of a skeptical crowd and a skeleton crew, Hughes climbed into the cockpit of the H-4 Hercules, and against all odds, he flew it. Not far, only about 70 feet off the water, and just for a single mile. But it flew, and in Hughes's world that was enough. He had proven his point. The press had a field day. Some called it a stunt, others called it redemption. But one thing was clear. Hughes had cheated death and humiliation yet again. The Spruce Goose was never flown again, but Hughes kept it meticulously maintained for decades, just in case he needed to fly it again and remind the world of what he could do. Behind the triumphs, however, his mind was quietly unraveling. The XF-11 crash had left him with chronic pain and a morphine dependency. He began to isolate more severely, often locking himself in darkened rooms for days, sometimes weeks at a time. His hygiene deteriorated. He grew paranoid, surrounding himself with a rotating cast of aides who were instructed never to look directly at him, never to speak unless spoken to, and always, always, to handle things exactly the way he demanded, down to the inch. He avoided handshakes. He washed compulsively. He ate the same meals, prepared the same way, day after day. The man who once stared down death from the cockpit now flinched at dust particles. Still, in the public eye, he remained a towering figure, equal parts innovator, daredevil, and enigma. He was the man who flew faster than anyone, built machines that shouldn't have worked, and walked away from wreckage that would have killed ordinary men. But behind closed doors, the cracks were deepening. He wasn't falling yet, but the altitude was dropping fast. Now, when it came to his love life, Howard Hughes didn't fall in love. He conquered it. At least, that's how he saw it. In the golden era of Hollywood, he wasn't just a titan of aviation and film. He was a force of gravity for some of the most famous, fascinating, and formidable women in the world. Ava Gardner, Katharine Hepburn, Hedy Lamarr, Bette Davis, Jean Harlow. These weren't just names, they were legends, and one by one they found themselves in Hughes's orbit. Or maybe, more accurately, his web. To the public, Hughes was the ultimate catch, tall, brilliant, impossibly wealthy. A man of mystery and machinery who could buy anything, survive anything, and had the dangerous allure of someone constantly one step from unraveling. But to those who knew him intimately, really knew him, he was something else. Charming, yes, generous sometimes, but also controlling, obsessive, manipulative, and deeply afraid of losing control, especially of women. Let's start with Jean Harlow. She was the original platinum blonde bombshell, but a studio-engineered goddess of the screen with a tragic aura. Hughes signed her to a contract early in her career and cast her in Hell's Angels. While the rumors of a full-blown affair between them remain unconfirmed, there's no doubt he was fascinated by her. He tried to micromanage her career, her public image, even her hair color. And when she died suddenly at just 26, Hughes reportedly bought the film rights to her life, just to make sure no one else could tell her story. Then came Katharine Hepburn. They were opposites on paper. She, fiercely independent and defiantly unconventional. He, reclusive, aloof, and obsessed with control. But somehow, for a time, it worked. Their affair began in the 1930s, during Hepburn's rise and Hughes's Hollywood high point. She later described him as brilliant but emotionally remote, and their relationship as intense but unsustainable. Hughes, according to many accounts, tried to reshape Hepburn, pressuring her to soften her appearance, to be more feminine in public, to better match the image he wanted her to reflect. She refused. Hepburn eventually left him, emotionally bruised but unbroken. Years later, she helped fictionalize their relationship for The Aviator, though she made it clear that the film captured only the outer shell of what they'd shared and what they'd suffered. Then there was Ava Gardner. Fiery, fearless, and unapologetically sensual, Gardner was everything Hughes couldn't control, and that made him want her even more. Their relationship was volcanic. Lavish gifts, dramatic arguments, passionate reconciliations. But underneath the glamour was a sinister edge. Gardner would later recount how Hughes hired private detectives to follow her, tapped her phones, and tried to isolate her from friends and other lovers. According to some sources, he even staged a fake car crash to win her sympathy after a fight. Gardner eventually escaped the relationship, but not without scars. Howard was a complicated man, she once said, beautiful in the head, but broken in the soul. Hughes didn't fall in love so much as he collected it. like rare coins or aircraft, and once he had a woman's attention, he held on to it with a vice grip. Those who resisted or escaped often found their reputations subtly smeared, their careers quietly stifled. Those who stayed paid in other ways. Hedy Lamarr, the Austrian actress and inventor, was another rumoured entanglement. There's no confirmed romantic relationship between them, but Hughes admired her deeply, especially her intellect. He reportedly gave her access to his engineers and encouraged her ideas, including an early version of frequency-hopping technology that would one day become the basis for modern Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. It was one of the rare instances where Hughes nurtured a woman's genius instead of trying to control it. Still, even this admiration came wrapped in surveillance and scrutiny. Hughes never really trusted anyone, and when it came to women, his distrust bloomed into obsession. He didn't just date, he monitored. Multiple former lovers have spoken about Hughes's unsettling need to know where they were, what they were doing, and who they were talking to at all times. He employed private investigators like most men employ chauffeurs. He read love letters like dossiers. He bought silence with gifts, lawyers, and fear. Bette Davis, never one to be caged, reportedly turned him down flat. According to Hollywood law, she found his manner creepy, his eyes too calculating. The details vary depending on the source, but most agree on one point: Davis didn't fall under his spell. And Hughes, unused to rejection, moved on quickly, but not without bruised pride. Jane Russell was another matter entirely. He discovered her, after all. Cast her in The Outlaw, a film more famous for her cleavage than its content. The studio censors balked at the film's overt sexuality. Hughes responded not with edits, but with engineering. He reportedly designed a custom bra to accentuate Russell's figure, though Russell later claimed she never wore it because it was too uncomfortable. Whether their relationship was romantic is still debated. Some say yes, citing long hours alone and his tendency to groom his muses. Others insist it was strictly professional, albeit in the most invasive, controlling sense. Then there's Gina Lollobrigida, the Italian beauty often referred to as the most beautiful woman in the world. Rumours of an affair with Hughes swirled for decades. In later interviews, she claimed he spent years trying to woo her, bombarding her with gifts, letters, and proposals. She insisted they were never lovers. He insisted she was his fiancée. Two completely different versions of reality, both told with conviction. Before their story dissolved into decades of rumour, misinterpretation, and lawsuits, Hughes and Gina Lollobrigida actually met under relatively mundane circumstances. It was the early 1950s, and Lollobrigida, already a rising star in European cinema, had caught the eye of American studios and, more fatefully, of Howard Hughes. He summoned her to Los Angeles under the guise of a professional opportunity, inviting her to meet with him about expanding her career into the American market. Flattered, she came. And that's when things got strange. Lollobrigida later described her arrival in Hollywood as something out of a psychological thriller. She was placed not in a hotel of her choosing, but in one of Hughes's own controlled suites. According to her, she was effectively imprisoned, denied access to a phone, unable to leave freely, and constantly monitored. Hughes, she said, isolated her from outside contact, claiming it was for her protection from the media, the chaos, the contracts. But over time, it became clear he had another agenda. Despite the fact that she was married at the time, Hughes reportedly made romantic and sexual advances, sometimes subtle, sometimes not. He plied her with lavish gifts, long, rambling late-night phone calls, and promises of stardom in America. But when those failed, he pivoted to business manipulation. She claimed he tricked her into signing a contract that effectively locked her into an exclusive agreement with Hughes's company, one that barred her from working with any other Hollywood studio. What she thought would be the beginning of an international breakthrough turned into a gilded cage. When Lollobrigida refused his advances and began pushing back against the contract, Hughes retaliated, not loudly but effectively. For years, he allegedly used legal threats and behind-the-scenes interference to stifle her Hollywood career. While she thrived in European cinema, her American opportunities mysteriously evaporated. Lollobrigida repeated this story over the years, particularly in the later stages of her life, and always with the same underlying sadness. She believed Hughes could have been a brilliant collaborator, even a friend. But instead, he treated her like a prize to be acquired. And when he couldn't have her, he set about erasing her from the spaces he controlled. She eventually escaped his contract, but not without a legal and emotional battle. Even decades later, when asked about Hughes, she spoke with a mixture of pity and contempt. He didn't want a woman, she once said. He wanted possession. That was Hughes in a nutshell. For every woman he tried to claim, there were whispers of coercion. Emotional manipulation was his currency. He didn't understand partnership. He understood possession. His romances were rarely mutual. They were power struggles draped in roses. And the heartbreak wasn't one-sided. Hughes himself, despite his wealth and genius, was almost always lonely. Women thrilled him, but also terrified him. They were unpredictable, independent, human. That, above all, frightened him. He wanted intimacy, but only on his terms. And when he couldn't control it, he withdrew, deeper and deeper into isolation. By the late 1950s, most of the great loves of his life had fled, fallen out, or faded away. He remained surrounded by women, actresses under contract, showgirls paid to smile, secretaries trained to never make eye contact, but the true connections were gone. What remained was surveillance, paranoia, silence. In public, he was still the glamorous tycoon who had romanced Hollywood's most radiant stars. In private, he was a man pacing the halls of empty hotel suites, watching old movies of women he once loved, and wondering whether they had ever truly loved him back. Howard Hughes had always been eccentric, but after 1946, his eccentricities began mutating, stretching and warping into something darker, something unstable. That was the year he nearly died. He was flying an experimental aircraft of his own design, the XF-11, a sleek twin-boom reconnaissance plane over Beverly Hills. On paper, the flight was a test run. In reality, it was Hughes doing what Hughes always did, pushing limits. He crashed, hard. The plane slammed into 3 houses. One was destroyed. Hughes was pulled from the flaming wreckage by a Marine Corps veteran who lived nearby, his chest punctured, ribs shattered, collarbone broken, lungs collapsed. For weeks he hovered near death, but he survived. And he didn't just survive, he emerged transformed. Physically, Hughes would never fully recover. His body, already worn from previous accidents and the stress of perpetual overwork, became a prison. He was in constant pain, addicted to codeine and later morphine. But the real damage was deeper, in the mind. The near-death experience didn't inspire humility or gratitude. It supercharged his paranoia. He became more reclusive, more suspicious, more obsessed with controlling every variable in his increasingly chaotic universe. The world saw a wounded genius, a tragic hero. But behind closed doors, Hughes was unraveling, thread by thread. And nowhere was that unraveling more visible than in his relationship with power. In 1948, Hughes took over RKO Pictures, one of the 5 major Hollywood studios at the time. The acquisition seemed like a logical extension of his dual obsessions, aviation and cinema. But RKO wasn't just a business investment, it became a sandbox for his compulsions. He started firing executives at will, often replacing them with yes-men who had no idea how to run a studio. Entire productions were halted mid-shoot. Scripts were shelved indefinitely. Hundreds of employees were dismissed for reasons that ranged from communist sympathies to bad vibes. He read every memo. He second-guessed every casting choice. He even dictated the placement of minor props in set designs. And he did all of this remotely, often from a darkened screening room or a suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel, where he would watch the same film reels for hours, obsessively analyzing facial expressions, camera angles, or the tiniest wardrobe inconsistencies. One assistant recalled being told to splice together a cut of a film using 23 different takes of a single line, because Hughes couldn't decide which eyebrow twitch he preferred. As McCarthyism gripped Hollywood, Hughes leaned into it. He began blacklisting actors, writers, and directors whom he claimed had communist ties, sometimes based on nothing more than a hunch or a vague accusation. Careers were destroyed, lives upended. Hughes didn't care. In his mind, it was all about eliminating risk. Control or chaos. Those were the only options. The press, once enamored by his genius and glamour, began to turn. Rumors circulated that Hughes had vanished, that he was in hiding, that he'd gone mad. In truth, he had simply stopped appearing in public. By the early 1950s, Hughes had developed a habit of sudden disappearances. He would vanish for weeks, sometimes months, holed up in hotel suites with blackout curtains, a select crew of trusted aides, and a meticulous daily ritual that often involved sitting naked in the dark, watching movies and eating the same meal over and over: roast beef sandwiches, chocolate bars, milk. He spoke through notes. He didn't shake hands. He began wearing tissue boxes on his feet to avoid germs from the carpet. His obsession with cleanliness, seeded in childhood by his mother's suffocating fear of disease, now ruled his life. He refused to touch doorknobs. He burned his clothing if he thought it had been contaminated. He ordered his aides to wash their hands repeatedly and to follow bizarre routines, rituals that made sense only to him. These weren't just quirks anymore. This was a pathology. He became obsessed with the Mormon Church. Not for religious reasons, but because he believed Mormons were clean, honest, and obedient. Many of his personal aides during this period were devout Mormons. They followed his rules without question. They didn't drink, they didn't gamble. Most importantly, they didn't leak stories to the press. To Hughes, they were the perfect human firewall. Meanwhile, RKO was crumbling. Under Hughes's erratic leadership, the studio produced fewer and fewer hits. Talented directors and actors fled. Theatre owners began to avoid RKO films entirely. In 1955, Hughes sold the company, only to buy it back months later when he feared the new owners would expose embarrassing internal memos. It was a cycle of self-sabotage: control, release, panic, reclaim. By the time he finally let go of RKO for good in 1957, the studio was a shell of its former self. One of Hollywood's most iconic institutions had been bled dry by Hughes's paranoia, indecision, and need to micromanage every frame of every film. And still, he didn't stop. Lawsuits piled up. Former employees sued for wrongful termination. Government investigations began circling his defense contracts. Senators questioned whether Hughes was defrauding the U.S. military, particularly over delays and cost overruns related to the Hercules H-4, better known as the Spruce Goose. The enormous wooden aircraft meant to carry troops across the Atlantic had only flown once, in 1947, for less than a minute. But Hughes clung to it as proof of his genius. "I put the sweat of my life into this thing," he declared. "I have my reputation staked on it." His empire was built on genius, yes, but it was also propped up by delusion, drugs, and the sheer inertia of wealth. Even when he disappeared from the public eye, he was still making moves. He controlled TWA, still held massive defense contracts, and retained key shares in a portfolio of companies. But increasingly, the decision-making passed from Hughes to the ghost of Hughes. An invisible hand scrawling notes on legal pads, whispering orders through intermediaries, barricading himself behind layers of silence. In 1958, he married actress Jean Peters, but the union was strange from the start. They were rarely seen together. Some accounts claim they lived apart for most of their marriage. Others suggest she was the last woman to get close to him, though even she was eventually driven away by his compulsions. When they divorced in 1971, she received only a modest settlement. No tell-all memoirs, no interviews, just silence. It was rumoured Hughes had her followed for years after the split, just to make sure she stayed quiet. The 1950s ended not with a bang for Howard Hughes, but with a flicker, like a reel winding down in an empty projection booth. He was still alive, still rich, still technically in charge. But the man who once flew higher and faster than anyone else, who had romanced the queens of cinema and bent entire industries to his will, was now a ghost in his own empire. The world had started to move on. But Hughes? He was still back there somewhere, alone in a dark room, staring at a screen, searching for the one perfect frame. By the time the 1960s were in full swing, Howard Hughes had transformed from mogul to myth, and then to something even stranger. He wasn't just secretive now. He was vanishing, slowly, deliberately, and with the same obsessive precision he once applied to airplanes and film frames. There were no public appearances, no new photographs, just an increasing number of strange memos, dozens a day, typed or dictated from behind closed doors and sent scuttling through legal channels, personal aides, and corporate hierarchies like ghostly edicts from a king who had exiled himself from his own court. This was not retirement. This was retreat. And Hughes didn't just disappear from the public eye. He engineered his own disappearance. He had long since abandoned the idea of a normal home. By 1967, he was holed up in a series of blacked-out hotel rooms, first in Las Vegas, then moving through the Caribbean and Latin America like a shadow, each location more locked down than the last. He lived in near-total darkness, windows sealed with masking tape and blackout curtains. All daylight was banished. Air filters buzzed constantly. His rooms were sterilized, or at least made to seem so by underlings terrified of doing anything wrong. And what counted as wrong became increasingly bizarre. Facts confirmed by former aides paint a picture that reads like surreal horror. Hughes storing his urine in glass bottles, fingernails and hair grown to grotesque lengths, naked most of the time, refusing to bathe, speaking rarely and often incomprehensibly. He refused to touch others. Any item, whether it was food, clothing, or even a bar of soap, had to be wrapped in multiple layers of tissue. His fear of germs, once a quirk, had now metastasized into a full-blown psychosis. There were jars of meticulously sorted nail clippings. Used tissues were stored or flushed, depending on the memo of the day. Every object entering his room had to be sterilized, double-bagged, or, if he got a bad feeling, discarded altogether, no matter how expensive or irreplaceable. Entire meals went uneaten if a single procedural step was missed. He communicated through scribbled notes or recorded tapes, sometimes directing his aides in minute, incomprehensible detail, like how a spoon should be angled on a tray, or how the temperature in the room must be measured down to a specific decimal. His personal staff often worked 24-hour shifts, forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Those who slipped up were exiled, sometimes without notice, sometimes without pay. He began hiring almost exclusively young Mormon men to serve as his aides and gatekeepers, trusting them, it was said, because of their sobriety, their perceived obedience, and their tight-lipped religious background. These men, nicknamed the Mormon Mafia, ran his world. They managed his daily routine, protected his isolation, and ensured that no one got too close. Some did so loyally. Others later spoke out about a world that felt more like a cult compound than a business empire. But make no mistake, Hughes was still in control, at least on paper. Through this curtain of madness, Hughes continued to run his empire, or more accurately, he micromanaged it to a standstill. He issued multi-page memos about product specifications, film licensing, employee attire, government contracts, and bottle cap designs with the same intensity he once applied to aircraft engineering. But his commands were increasingly erratic. He would contradict earlier decisions or spiral into tangents. Legal teams spent weeks decoding memos that amounted to little more than paranoid ramblings. He fired trusted advisors on a whim. Companies lost direction. Fortunes were misallocated. One moment he'd demand an immediate acquisition of a hotel, a TV station, a mining company. The next, he'd refuse to sign a check, claiming it had been contaminated. Some businesses collapsed from neglect. Others survived only because executives learned how to work around him, humoring his demands without expecting follow-through. Hughes's power, once kinetic and ferocious, had curdled into a kind of gravitational pull. People, companies, and entire industries orbited a man who no longer moved. The world still reacted to him, but he no longer responded in return. Meanwhile, his methods for maintaining control grew darker. He had always been willing to manipulate and coerce, but by the 1970s, bribery had become Hughes's most reliable tool. Through shell companies and intermediaries, he made secret political contributions, some of them legal, many of them not. He paid off regulators, delayed court cases, blocked legislation, and funded candidates who would protect his interests. In some circles, this was called influence. In others, blackmail. There were even whispers, though never proven, that Hughes had files on the personal lives of powerful men. Rumors, not facts, but the kind that refused to die. Dossiers full of affairs, addictions, debts, and criminal activity, gathered through private investigators and held like nuclear codes in Hughes's vault of secrets. What is not rumor, however, is how completely he now trusted no one. He no longer saw friends. Family was kept at a distance. He rarely even spoke to board members of his own companies. Nurses were rotated constantly, sometimes because he believed they were spies, other times because he simply didn't like the way they looked at him. Once, according to court testimony, he fired a nurse for folding a tissue the wrong way. By 1973, Hughes was reportedly bouncing between properties in the Bahamas, Nicaragua, Canada, and Mexico, with each location more secretive than the last. Even the Mormon aides were often kept in the dark about where they'd be going next. Hughes communicated mostly by memo, sometimes delaying decisions for weeks while entire corporations waited in limbo. There were frequent health scares, some real, others imagined. He suffered from chronic pain, believed to be the result of old injuries from his near-fatal crashes. But instead of doctors, he trusted only his inner circle, many of whom had no medical training. He self-medicated, a known fact, with an escalating cocktail of codeine, Valium, barbiturates, and sleeping pills. Pharmacy records show that Hughes consumed drugs in quantities that would have killed most people. But Hughes somehow endured. For years, reporters and private investigators tried to locate him, to verify he was even still alive. None succeeded. Photos were impossible to obtain. Eyewitnesses were silenced with legal threats or payoffs. When the forged autobiography by Clifford Irving exploded into the news in 1971, it only added fuel to the fire. Hughes denounced the book in a rare telephone call, his voice thin and strained. But even that recording raised questions. Was it truly him? Or had the myth become so large that even his voice no longer sounded real? By the end of the 1970s, Hughes wasn't just a recluse. He was something else entirely. A billionaire ghost. A man who controlled satellites and senators but couldn't touch a doorknob without gloves. He had become both prisoner and warden of his own mind, sealed off from the world behind layers of cotton swabs, tissue boxes, blackout curtains, and fear. And though he was still technically alive, still signing memos, still moving from one anonymous hotel suite to the next, Howard Hughes was already fading. What came next was inevitable. But the way it happened, that was pure Hughes. Howard Hughes had spent decades building an empire from sheer will, obsessive control, and a kind of brilliance that defied easy classification. But by the early 1970s, even that will was wearing thin. He had stopped appearing in public, yes, but more than that, he had begun vanishing from the inside out. This was no longer the story of a powerful man going dark. This was a man flickering, physically, mentally, spiritually, on the edge of extinction. Reports from those few who actually saw him during these final years paint a chilling picture. Hughes wasn't just thin, he was skeletal. He weighed somewhere between 90 and 100 pounds, depending on which record or hospital official you believe. His hair was long, matted, and patchy. His nails were curled, yellow, inches long. He rarely bathed. He reportedly sat naked for hours, sometimes days, watching the same movie over and over again. Ice Station Zebra was his favorite. He screened it so many times that hotel staff lost count. He had become a prisoner of his own compulsions. Every surface had to be covered, every object had to be wrapped. He refused to speak to most people directly. Those who did manage to get near him reported that his speech was often slurred or nonsensical, either due to the drugs or the mental fog, or both. And the drugs? They were plentiful. Hughes had by now developed a brutal dependence on painkillers: codeine, Valium, Librium, morphine. The pharmacy records, eventually revealed through court documents, are staggering. Doctors, or men posing as doctors, were flown in to administer injections without asking questions. He had long abandoned traditional medical care, instead preferring what one former aide described as custom chemistry. Dosages were adjusted on a whim. Some days he wanted to sleep for 20 hours. Others he wanted to be alert enough to micromanage hotel staff, TV station executives, or federal lobbyists, though what passed for management in these final years was more often gibberish than guidance. Still, his business interests lingered on like the orbit of a dead star. In name, Hughes remained the head of a sprawling empire: Hughes Tool Company, Hughes Aircraft, Hughes Helicopters, Hughes Communications, Trans World Airlines stock, vast real estate holdings, entire casinos. But his influence was now exercised almost entirely through intermediaries, primarily the so-called Mormon Mafia, his trusted aides who increasingly acted as gatekeepers, handlers, and, some say, puppet masters. And then there were the bribes. In 1972, a series of investigations began unraveling the scope of Hughes's political manipulations. Most infamously, he had made secret campaign donations to President Richard Nixon's re-election effort, contributions that helped spark the Watergate scandal. One of Nixon's aides, Charles Colson, would later admit Hughes had promised at least $100,000 to the campaign. The full number may have been much higher. Nixon, for his part, feared Hughes, feared what he knew, feared what he might say, if indeed he could say anything at all anymore. The irony, of course, is that Hughes wasn't really in control of anything by this point. The empire was being siphoned off. Trusts were mismanaged. Corporate divisions quietly sold or left to rot. Rumors swirled that his handlers were drugging him further to keep him docile, to get his signature on documents he didn't understand. There is no hard proof of this, no smoking gun, but multiple court depositions taken after his death suggest Hughes was routinely kept in a dazed, semi-coherent state during key financial decisions. He drifted between hotels and hospital suites like a spectre: the Britannia Beach Hotel in the Bahamas, the Intercontinental in Managua, a penthouse in Vancouver, a private villa in Acapulco, each stop more remote, each room more heavily guarded. He surrounded himself with blackout curtains, HEPA filters, sealed doors, and silence. Paranoia had become his only companion. By 1976, Hughes had retreated to the Acapulco Princess Hotel in Mexico. His body was in ruin. He suffered from kidney failure, his teeth were falling out, his skin was covered in ulcers and bed sores, some reportedly gangrenous. And yet no proper doctor was called until the very last moment. On April 5, 1976, Hughes finally collapsed. His aides rushed him to Houston on a chartered jet, hoping, possibly naively, to get him into Methodist Hospital alive, but it was too late. Howard Hughes was pronounced dead en route. The cause? Officially, kidney failure. But unofficially, the theories abound. One post-mortem report described Hughes's condition as catastrophic. He had multiple broken-off needles embedded in his arms. His fingernails were described as longer than any corpse we've seen. His body was covered in lesions and bruises. One medical examiner said it was the worst condition he had ever seen for a man who had not suffered overt trauma. At the time of his death, Hughes was unrecognizable, literally. The FBI had to use fingerprints to confirm his identity. No one could say for sure how long he had truly been gone, mentally or even legally. The fact that he died on a private jet, thousands of feet in the air, only deepened the mystique. And the conspiracy theories followed, of course. Some said Hughes had been slowly murdered, poisoned or overdrugged to gain control of his fortune. Others claimed he hadn't died at all, that a body double had been used and Hughes had slipped away to die in some forgotten part of the world, free from scrutiny at last. Those rumours were, and remain, pure speculation. There is no credible evidence that Hughes survived past April 1976, but when a man spends half his life hiding, is it any wonder people believed he might have pulled one last vanishing act? In the hours after his death was confirmed, there was no grand statement, no public will, no funeral, no gravestone marked Howard Robert Hughes Jr. Instead, there was silence. Fitting, but not for long. The moment Hughes was declared dead, the feeding frenzy began. And what followed? Battles, betrayals, fake wills, and a global hunt for scraps of his empire would become its own kind of legacy. When Howard Hughes died in 1976, he left behind no known verified will, no final instructions, no heirs. Just a $2.5 billion estate and a vacuum of power that would invite decades of legal warfare, speculation, fraud, and media frenzy. In true Hughes fashion, even in death, he remained the most private man on earth, while becoming the center of one of the loudest and most chaotic estate battles in American history. Within weeks of his death, dozens of heirs appeared. Cousins, distant relatives, alleged mistresses, former employees. One man even claimed to be Hughes's illegitimate son, offering grainy photos and half-legible letters as evidence. It wasn't long before a will surfaced, allegedly written by Hughes and discovered in the headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. It became known as the Mormon Will. This document, typed, signed, and witnessed, named a wide array of beneficiaries, including the church itself, multiple former aides, and a gas station owner named Melvin Dummer, who claimed to have rescued Hughes from the Nevada desert years earlier. According to Dummer, a gaunt, unkempt man had asked for a ride to Las Vegas. Weeks later, Dummer said he was stunned to learn this man had been Hughes, and shocked again to find himself listed as a beneficiary in the will. The courts were less convinced. After years of litigation and handwriting analysis, the Mormon will was ruled a forgery. Dummer was cut out. The estate at last was divided among 22 of Hughes's relatives, most of whom hadn't seen or spoken to him in decades. The IRS, meanwhile, took its slice, nearly $170 million in estate taxes. No single heir walked away with even a fraction of Hughes's former fortune. The empire had been sliced, sold, and settled. His companies were absorbed or dismantled. His Las Vegas holdings disappeared into the hands of emerging casino moguls. Hughes Aircraft was sold to General Motors. The Hughes legacy had officially moved from one man to a boardroom. And yet, Howard Hughes's story didn't end there. Not really. Because his legacy, unlike his body, refused to decay quietly. In aviation, Hughes remains a pioneer. He designed and flew aircraft that pushed boundaries in both speed and altitude. The H-1 Racer set a transcontinental speed record. The Hughes XF-11 and H-4 Hercules, though marred by failure or limited use, still symbolized the ambition of pushing beyond what was considered possible. Hughes Aircraft, at its peak, was one of the largest defense contractors in the world, contributing to the development of radar systems, guided missiles, and aerospace technologies still foundational today. He didn't just fly fast. he altered the direction of flight itself. In cinema, Hughes's fingerprints are less technical, but no less lasting. His obsession with spectacle, scandal, and sex appeal redefined early Hollywood. Hell's Angels broke visual boundaries. The Outlaw challenged censors and played the long game in marketing a film based on controversy. He helped launch or supercharge the careers of Jean Harlow, Jane Russell, and others, while his reign at RKO Pictures left behind a fractured but fascinating chapter in film history. He wasn't a storyteller. He was a showman. And the medium was never quite the same after him. But it's his mental health and his descent into isolation that has perhaps become the most resonant and haunting piece of his legacy. In the decades following his death, Hughes came to symbolize the dangers of unchecked genius, the price of obsession, and the destructive gravity of untreated mental illness. What we once called eccentricity in Hughes's behavior has since been re-evaluated through a more clinical lens. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, anxiety, depression, possibly schizophrenia or drug-induced psychosis. No single diagnosis covers it all, and modern experts often argue over what precisely afflicted him. But one thing is clear: Hughes was suffering, and no one around him, or perhaps no one allowed near him, could intervene. He became a cautionary tale wrapped in money, myth, and madness. His name shows up in college psychology textbooks next to case studies on isolation and obsessive behavior. He's invoked in debates about wealth and mental health, about how power can insulate a person not just from scrutiny, but from help. And in a culture obsessed with celebrity meltdowns and self-destruction, Hughes was the original recluse king, a man who had everything and burned it down just to sit in the ashes. But the echo of Hughes also lives on in pop culture, where his life has been mythologized again and again. Martin Scorsese's The Aviator, 2004, brought Leonardo DiCaprio's version of Hughes to a new generation, a portrayal that, while dramatized, nailed the core paradox. A man who could design cutting-edge airplanes with godlike insight, but couldn't touch a doorknob without a tissue. Writers, musicians, and filmmakers continue to reference him, from The Rocketeer to Iron Man's Tony Stark, from Joni Mitchell's lyrics to documentaries that try to separate the myth from the man. And that's the thing, you can't separate them. Howard Hughes was the myth. He was the boy genius, the Hollywood god, the aviation pioneer, the seducer, the destroyer, the ghost wrapped in silk sheets. His life reads like fiction because fiction couldn't possibly do it justice. He didn't just move through history, he warped it around him. He left behind no children, no memoirs, no final words, only a vacuum, a shape in the world that only Howard Hughes could have filled. And once he was gone, we all just kept staring at that empty space, wondering how someone so brilliant, so powerful, so rich, could fall so far and take so many pieces of the world with him when he did. That's the final legacy of Howard Hughes. Not just the empire he built, or the madness he descended into, but the impossible, unshakable weight of a man who tried to live like a god and died like a ghost.